She didn't leave him. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry or scream or pack a bag in the middle of the night. She sat at his desk, in his office, in his building, and she quietly, methodically, and with 14 years of documentation organized into 17 folders, destroyed everything he had ever built. And he found out at dinner. This channel goes where every mainstream documentary is too afraid to follow. If that is the kind of story you have been looking for, subscribe right now. Then do not move, because it starts in 10 seconds. It is 9:04 in the morning. The city of Lagos is already alive outside the glass. The generators, the okadas, the smell of exhaust, and rain-wet concrete rising 31 floors from the streets below. But inside Suite 3107, the air is cold and still and completely silent, except for the sound of a woman turning the last page of a red leather notebook. She closes it, sets it down, places it in the center of 17 manila folders that she has spent 14 years filling. Not 14 weeks, not 14 months, 14 years. Her name is Soo-Yeon Adaeze Nwosu. She is 50 years old. She has a first-class degree in finance from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. She has been married to the man whose name is on this building for 26 years. She has raised 3 children in the house he bought her. She has attended every event, smiled in every photograph, sat at every table, and worn the appropriate dress to every function where her presence was required as evidence that the man standing beside her was the kind of man who had the right kind of wife. She has also, every morning for 14 years, been writing down everything she saw. Everything. She stands, straightens her dress, picks up her phone. The call she makes lasts 41 seconds. She does not raise her voice. She does not cry. She speaks with the quiet, unhurried precision of someone who has been rehearsing this moment not for days or weeks, but for the entire second half of her adult life. Then she ends the call, places the phone face down on the desk, and stands completely still in the Lagos morning light for exactly 11 seconds. After those 11 seconds, she picks up the folders, walks to the elevator, descends 31 floors through the building that bears her husband's name, crosses the marble lobby where the staff greet her with the deference they have always shown the chairman's wife, and steps out into the heat. By 9:47 that morning, 3 separate filings have been submitted simultaneously to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the Central Bank of Nigeria, and a federal court in Abuja. By noon, accounts holding an estimated $1.2 billion across 11 institutions in 6 countries are frozen. Frozen. Not flagged. Not reviewed. Not suspended pending inquiry. Frozen. Her husband, Soo-Yeon Adaeze, founder, chairman, and absolute sovereign of one of West Africa's most powerful private empires, is in Accra when his phone begins. He is at lunch. He is at a window table at the Kempinski Gold Coast Hotel that he specifically requested that morning. He is in the middle of a sentence. He does not finish it. He will not speak to Soo-Yeon directly for 11 days. In those 11 days that the people who worked inside the Nwosu group would later describe as watching a building come down in slow motion, each floor collapsing into the one below it with terrible architectural precision. Every layer of the empire he spent 26 years constructing begins to come apart. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the subsidiary networks, the political relationships built across 3 administrations that had made him untouchable, the social architecture, the foundation, the hospital wing, the university building, the 40,000 children fed annually across 3 states. All of it begins to vibrate with the specific, irreversible frequency of a structure whose foundation has been removed from beneath it. And the woman who removed it had been standing inside it the entire time. What you are about to hear was not reported. Not fully. Not honestly. not with the weight that this story carries. The numbers appeared in newspapers. The charges appeared on legal databases. The sentencing was noted in the financial press with the same brevity that the financial press reserves for stories it does not fully understand. But the human story underneath, the 14 years, the red leather notebook, the 41-second call, the 11 seconds of stillness in a 31st floor office, the lunch in Accra that ended mid-sentence. That story was never told. Until now. Most people who hear the name Adaeze Nwosu think they know what he was. A billionaire, a philanthropist, a self-made titan, a man whose name was on buildings in 4 Nigerian cities, and whose foundation fed 40,000 children, and whose face appeared in Forbes Africa twice in the same decade with the specific, composed confidence of a man who has nothing to conceal. You are about to become one of the very few people who understand what he actually was. And more importantly, who actually held the power. Stay exactly where you are. Because this story does not begin at 9:04 in the morning on that Tuesday in Lagos. It begins 27 years earlier in a 2-room house in Onitsha with a girl sitting at a kitchen table watching her mother write everything down. And it begins with a notebook, a small red leather notebook that a Korean-Nigerian woman pressed into her daughter's hands on a wedding morning in 1996 and said 7 words that neither of them knew at that moment would one day dismantle a billion-dollar empire. Write everything down. A woman who keeps records keeps power. Remember those words. Because in 90 minutes, when this story reaches its ending, you're going to come back to them. And everything you heard before them will sound different. Before we go any further, I need you to drop a comment right now and answer this honestly. Soo-Yeon Adaeze spent 14 years inside this empire. She raised his children. She managed his household. She attended every event, every dinner, every state function. She smiled in every photograph. She stood at his side at the hospital opening and applauded with everyone else when they unveiled the wing that bore his name. And every single day, she was collecting evidence. Every single day. So tell me this. Was what she did an act of extraordinary courage? The long, silent, dangerous work of a woman who understood exactly what she was living inside and made the choice to document it rather than pretend it wasn't there? Or was it the coldest, most calculated betrayal in the history of Nigerian business? 14 years of performance, 14 years of smiling for photographs and attending dinners, 14 years of allowing a man to believe he was trusted absolutely by the person who knew him most completely? There's no simple answer. I've been thinking about this question for 4 weeks since I finished the research. I have not resolved it. That is exactly why I want yours. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now, back to Onitsha. Back to the beginning. Back to the girl with the notebook. Soo-Yeon Adaeze was born in 1971 in Onitsha, in Anambra State, the second of 4 children raised in a household that existed, by every external measure, at the intersection of 2 worlds that had no particular reason to meet. Her father, Chukwemeka Adaeze, was Igbo, a provisions trader whose stall on a main market road had operated continuously since 1962 and whose reputation for fair pricing and accurate weights was the kind of reputation that takes a generation to build and survives in a community's memory for another generation after the man himself is gone. He was not wealthy. He was reliable. In Onitsha in the 1970s, the distinction between those 2 things was navigated daily by every family on every street. Her mother, Kim Hye-jin, had arrived in Nigeria in 1966, 22 years old, newly married to a Korean textile importer who had identified Lagos as an emerging market and Onitsha as the inland distribution point that would make his business viable. The marriage lasted 4 years. The business lasted 3. What lasted because Hygiene had looked at the landscape of her options at 26 years old in a country she had not been born in and made the specific, unsentimental calculation that her best future was here, was Hygiene herself. She stayed. She learned Igbo with the methodical patience of someone who understood that language is not courtesy. It is infrastructure. She built a small textile import operation of her own, modest but consistent, that survived the turbulence of the late 1970s and early 1980s through a combination of careful inventory management and the kind of social intelligence that comes from spending a decade as an outsider who has chosen to become an insider. She met Chukwuemeka Adaeze in 1969. They married in 1970. Their children were born into a household that was, as a result of this specific history, fluent in more than one way of seeing the world. That detail matters. Remember it. Hygiene taught her children two things above all others. The first was mathematics, not as an academic subject, as a survival language. Numbers, she told them, are the only part of any transaction that cannot be reinterpreted after the fact. Everything else, the agreement, the handshake, the promise, the relationship, is subject to revision by whoever has the most power in the room when the revision becomes convenient. But numbers, recorded correctly and preserved carefully, are immovable. They're the one thing that a person with less power can hold against a person with more. The second thing she taught them was record keeping. Every evening, without exception, Hygiene sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down everything that had happened that day. What was spent? She attended the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, on a merit scholarship, graduated in 1993 with a first-class degree in finance, and returned to Lagos with the specific, directed ambition of someone who has spent 22 years preparing for a destination they can describe precisely even if they cannot yet name it. She was precise. She was disciplined. She was, by every account from people who knew her in those early post-university years, completely certain, with the kind of certainty that does not require announcement, that she was going to build something that mattered. She had not yet met Soo-Yeon Adaeze Nwosu. Kwame was the son of a Yoruba businessman and a Korean-Nigerian woman from Ibadan, which is to say that he and Soo-Yeon shared, from different angles and different family histories, the particular experience of growing up between two cultural inheritances that the world had not necessarily prepared a clear place for, and of building identity and competence in the space between them. He was 31 when they met at a business conference in Lagos in 1994. He had, by that point, already built the early architecture of what would become the Nwosu Group, a trading company with legitimate revenue, a name that was beginning to circulate in the rooms where names that would eventually matter first began to circulate, and a quality of stillness in a crowd that everyone who encountered him described, regardless of which language they used to describe it, with the same word. Commanding. Not loud. Not aggressive. Not the performed dominance of a man who needs the room to know he is important. The stillness of a man who has already assessed the room, identified every significant person in it, and decided what he needs from each of them before he has spoken a single word to any of them. He saw Soo-Yeon presenting a financial analysis for a client company on the second morning of the conference. He watched from the back of the room. He watched until she was done, and then he waited with the specific, disciplined patience that would later become one of the most remarked-upon qualities of his professional conduct, until the room had moved on, until the applause had finished and the conversation had shifted to the next presenter and Soo-Yeon had gathered her materials and was standing at the edge of the room with a glass of water. Then he crossed the room, introduced himself, and said 7 words that she would remember with complete accuracy for the rest of her life. You understand money the way most people understand their own language. He paused. You don't have to think about it. You just speak it. It was, by every account she ever gave of it to people she trusted, The most accurate thing anyone had ever said to her in her life up to that point. Not a compliment in the conventional sense. An observation. A precise one. The kind that lands differently than praise because it requires the person delivering it to have actually been paying attention. They had dinner that evening. They spoke for 4 hours. They married in 1996. She was 25. He was 33. And here is the detail that nobody who covered this story, in the newspapers, in the legal analyses, in the financial journalism that followed the EFCC proceedings, ever thought was significant enough to mention. On the morning of her wedding, Soo-Yeon's mother, Kim Hye-jin, gave her a gift. It was not jewelry. It was not money. It was not the kind of gift that photographs well or gets mentioned in the social pages coverage of a Lagos wedding attended by 200 people in a venue that cost more than Hye-jin's textile business had earned in its best year. It was a small red leather notebook. Practical. Beautiful in the specific way that useful things are beautiful. Personal in a way that only a gift chosen by someone who understands you completely can be personal. Write everything down, her mother told her, pressing the notebook into her hands in the private room where Soo-Yeon was waiting to walk into the ceremony. A woman who keeps records keeps power. Soo-Yeon placed it in her bag. She carried it into the ceremony. She carried it, or one exactly like it, because she replaced the notebook every 2 years when the pages filled, always the same red leather, always the same size, always purchased from the same stationery shop in Lagos Island that she visited with the quiet regularity of someone maintaining a private ritual for the next 26 years. In the early years of the marriage, the notebook was exactly what it appeared to be. Household accounts, staff schedules, grocery budgets, meeting times, appointment calendars, the exhaustive, unglamorous administrative infrastructure of a wealthy Lagos household managed with the precision of a small corporation, which is functionally what it was. Because that is what Soo-Yeon Nwosu brought to that household from the first day she entered it. Not decoration, not social grace, though she had that too. A first-class finance degree and 22 years of her mother's specific, practical philosophy about the relationship between documentation and power applied to the management of a domestic enterprise that was growing year by year as the business around it grew. She was good at it. She was extraordinary at it. In fact, in a way that people who are doing work that perfectly matches their actual capabilities are extraordinary at it, which is to say, without apparent effort, without drama, without the performance of competence that less capable people require. The house ran. The accounts balanced. The staff were paid correctly and on time. The dinner parties were executed with a precision that their guests experienced as effortless warmth. The children, a son born in 1998, a daughter in 2001, another son in 2004, grew up in a household that functioned from the outside as the ideal expression of what extraordinary wealth looked like when it was managed by people who understood both its possibilities and its responsibilities. But the business around her was changing, and Soo-Yeon Nwosu, the woman who understood money the way most people understand their own language, was paying attention. To understand what Soo-Yeon ultimately did, you have to understand what Kwame actually built. Not the public version. The public version, the hospitals and the foundations and the government contracts and the Forbes Africa profile that described him as a self-made titan who turned a small trading company into a continental enterprise over 2 decades of disciplined, visionary leadership. That version was not false exactly. It was a frame, a carefully, meticulously, professionally constructed frame around a picture that was considerably larger and considerably darker than anything visible within the frame itself. Kwame Nwosu's legitimate business operations were real and substantial. By 2005, the Nwosu Group's trading division had genuine revenues in excess of $200 million annually across logistics, real estate, and energy. He employed thousands of people across 14 countries. He paid taxes selectively, strategically, in the specific amounts and at the specific times that maintained the appearance of full compliance without the costly reality of it. He maintained relationships with regulatory bodies at a level of personal investment that was, in the technical language of the financial crime investigators who would later document it, more consistent with the management of risk than with the administration of a legitimate enterprise. But underneath the legitimate structure, growing alongside it, feeding from it and feeding into it, using its credibility as cover and its cash flow as camouflage, was a parallel architecture that Kwame had been building since the late 1990s. A network. Shell companies registered across the British Virgin Islands, Mauritius, Dubai, and Singapore, each with its own nominal director, its own registered address, its own paper history of unremarkable commercial activity, holding companies that held other holding companies, trust structures of sufficient legal sophistication that the attorneys who designed them charged fees that most Nigerian businesses could not have sustained as annual operating costs, let alone as the price of a single structural arrangement. All of it existing for a single purpose: to move money that could not be moved through visible channels, to take revenue generated through means that could not be documented publicly and transform it through a sequence of transactions across multiple jurisdictions into wealth that appeared on every piece of paper that a regulator, a journalist, or a law enforcement agency could access, to have originated in legitimate commerce. By 2010, investigators would later estimate that between $60 and $80 million was moving through this network annually. By 2015, that figure had grown to somewhere between $200 and $300 million per year. By 2019, the year Soo-Yeon finally made her call, the best estimates placed the total accumulated wealth concealed within the network at an amount the EFCC described in their initial filing, with a particular careful language of institutions that understand the consequences of imprecision, as no less than $1.2 billion and potentially significantly greater. $1.2 billion. How does a man build something this large without being caught? Part of the answer is patience. Part of it is intelligence. Part of it is the specific genius of a structure design so that no single person inside it can ever see enough of it to understand what the whole picture looks like. Kwame was meticulous about this, fanatically meticulous. Each person in the network knew their piece. Each transaction connected to the next through intermediary steps that were visible to the person completing them, but not to the person who had initiated them or the person who would benefit from them. The architecture was deliberately opaque, deliberately fragmented, deliberately designed to make the comprehensive view impossible for any single observer. Any single observer except the woman who managed the household accounts. And here is where the story gets morally complicated in a way I want you to sit with rather than move past quickly. Because to build what he built, Soo-Yeon Nwosu made a series of choices that are unforgivable by every moral and legal standard that exists in every jurisdiction in which he operated. He corrupted government officials. He compromised regulatory personnel. He moved money connected to operations that caused documented, measurable harm to real people in 3 countries. He suppressed journalism. He created the conditions in which people who might have spoken were given reasons not to. And yet, if you sit inside the world that produced him, the Nigeria of the 1980s and early 1990s, with its specific structural violence, its deliberate extraction of wealth from the many to concentrate it among the few, its educational system that produced excellent graduates for an economy that had not built the institutions those graduates needed in order to deploy their excellence legitimately. The specific, documented lesson that world teaches a young man of intelligence and ambition about what compliance with legitimate systems actually costs someone who begins without the right connections, without inherited capital, without the family name that opens the door before the knock. Part of you, if you're honest with yourself, will understand exactly why he made the first move. That is the part that should disturb you most. Not his choices, your understanding of them. Because your understanding of them is real, and it sits alongside your knowledge of what those choices cost. And the discomfort of holding both things simultaneously is the most honest response to this story that I can offer you. The first move was a real estate transaction in 2001. A residential property in Accra, purchased through a company registered in Mauritius 18 months earlier. A company with no other assets, no other liabilities, no other purpose except to be the vehicle through which this specific piece of real estate entered the world with a clean, documented, legally unimpeachable ownership structure. On paper, it was clean. In practice, it was the first brick. And this is the detail that investigators kept returning to in the years of analysis that followed. Kwame was extraordinary in this first move and in every move that followed it, about ensuring that no single person inside the structure ever saw enough of it to understand the whole. Each lawyer saw their piece. Each banker saw their account. Each director saw their company. The person in Mauritius did not know the person in Singapore. The person in Singapore did not know the person in Dubai. No one person had the view from above, except the woman who managed the household, because the household managed the accounts. And the accounts, the domestic accounts that passed through Soo-Yeon's hands every month as part of the entirely ordinary, entirely visible, entirely above-board management of a wealthy family's financial life, contain numbers. And those numbers, to a person with a first-class finance degree and the specific, disciplined habit of writing everything down, told a story. Not immediately, not in the first year or the second year or even the fifth year, but over time, over the particular accumulation of time that only patience can produce, the story became visible, pattern by pattern, account number by account number, transaction by transaction. She wrote it all down, every year, in the notebook. And Soo-Yeon Adaeze Nwosu, in the single most consequential mistake of a 26-year career built on the foundational principle of controlling information, of ensuring that no single person ever had access to the complete picture, never once asked his wife what she kept in hers. The point of no return, for Kwame, though he would not know it for another 13 years, was not a dramatic moment. It was an ordinary evening in 2006 when Soo-Yeon sat at her desk in the study of the Banana Island house after the children were asleep, opened a fresh notebook to the first page, and began to do something she had not done before. She began to organize. Not record. She had been recording for 10 years. She began to organize, to take the accumulated observations of a decade and arrange them into a sequence that had a beginning, a middle, and the clear architecture of a conclusion. To build, from the material she had been collecting since the second year of the marriage, something that resembled a case file. She was 35 years old. She had been married for 10 years. She had 12 years of data, and she had, though she could not yet name the date or the form it would take, a destination in mind. She had 14 more years of patience remaining. Between 2005 and 2015, Soo-Yeon Adaeze Nwosu's empire expanded with a speed and comprehensiveness that his contemporaries attributed. In the business press, at the conference panels where he was a recurring keynote, at the dinners where his name carried a weight that made other names careful in his presence, to genius, to luck, and to relationships that nobody could fully map. All three assessments were partially correct. The legitimate business grew genuinely and substantially. The Nwosu Group's logistics division became the largest private freight operation in West Africa by 2012, moving goods across 14 countries through a network of 340 trucks, 3 bonded warehouses, and relationships with port officials in Lagos, Tima, and Lomé that have been built, maintained, and carefully protected over 15 years of personal investment of the kind that does not appear on any balance sheet. The energy division secured 4 government contracts between 2009 and 2013 worth a combined $890 million. The procurement process through which these contracts were awarded was, in the formal documentation, entirely regular. 3 separate journalists, over the course of those years, attempted to investigate the actual mechanism by which the awards were made. One of them, a Lagos-based investigative reporter named Emeka Ose, spent 7 months developing a documented account of the procurement irregularities before his editor received a phone call from a source whose identity was never disclosed, after which the story was placed in an archive folder and not retrieved. Emeka Ose is alive. He currently works in corporate communications for a private company in Abuja. He has not published an investigation since 2013. He is one of several people in this story who understood something significant and made the calculation that the cost of acting on that understanding was greater than the cost of not acting on it. This part of the story never made the news. Not because it was not discovered. Pieces of it were discovered by Emeka Ose and by others at various points over a decade. But because the mechanism Kwame had built to manage exactly this kind of exposure had been operating quietly and effectively for years. There were people in 3 separate newsrooms, 2 regulatory agencies, and 1 government ministry who received, directly or through channels that provided sufficient distance for comfortable deniability, benefits that made certain questions feel less urgent than they had previously seemed. The benefits were not always money. Sometimes they were contracts. Sometimes they were introductions. Sometimes they were simply the knowledge, communicated through intermediaries, that the Nwosu group had a long memory and a consistent policy of rewarding loyalty and noting its absence. Most people who hear the name Kwame J1 Nwosu have no idea that this infrastructure existed. You're now one of the very few who do. Pay very close attention to what comes next, because this is the part of the story that changes everything you think you know about how empires of this kind actually function. By 2016, the peak year, Kwame's consolidated wealth, legitimate holdings and concealed assets combined, had reached an estimated $1.6 billion. He owned a residential compound on Banana Island in Lagos valued at $14 million. A townhouse in London's Mayfair district that had been purchased in 2011 for £9.4 million through UK-registered holding company whose ultimate beneficial owner was, after 3 layers of corporate structure, a trust registered in the Cayman Islands. A villa outside Abuja, used primarily for meetings whose participants preferred not to be seen entering the Nwosu Group's corporate offices. An apartment in Dubai registered in the name of a person who did not exist. A name constructed with sufficient documentary support to survive a surface-level compliance check and insufficient substance to survive any serious investigation. He traveled in a Gulfstream G650 leased through a company registered in the Cayman Islands. His primary residence employed 43 household staff. His personal security detail consisted of 12 men, 3 of whom had professional backgrounds in Nigerian state intelligence that he had discussed with no one and documented nowhere. In his professional life, he was the most composed person in every room he entered. People who negotiated against him described a quality of stillness that they reached for analogies to explain and never quite found the right ones. He could sit in a negotiation for 4 hours and speak 40 words. He could receive information, bad news, surprising news, the kind of news that causes other people's faces to shift even when they're trying to control them, and receive it with the absolute architectural stillness of a man who had already modeled the worst-case scenario before the meeting began and had long since passed through it into something that looked, from the outside, like acceptance, but was actually something more precise. He was not unafraid. He was afraid in advance and privately and completely. And by the time the source of the fear arrived in the room with him, he had already finished being afraid of it. 3 people in his professional circle feared him completely. 6 people worshipped him without reservation. The remaining people in his world, the lawyers, the bankers, the officials, the executives, the diplomats, operated in his orbit with a careful, calibrated awareness of people who understand that they are in the presence of someone whose intelligence significantly exceeds their own and who conduct themselves accordingly. And one person who had slept beside him for 22 years, who had raised 3 children in the same house as him, who knew the precise sound of his breathing when he was thinking through a problem versus the different precise sound of his breathing when he had resolved one, who knew the order in which he drank his morning coffee and the specific way he held his phone when the call he was taking was one he did not want to be observed making, understood him with a clarity that neither fear nor worship can produce. She understood that the empire had a flaw, not a structural flaw, not a legal flaw that any external investigator could have identified from the material available to them. A human flaw. Soo-Yeon Nwosu, the man who had built a $1.6 billion empire on the foundational principle that information must be controlled, fragmented, and distributed only in the precise portions that each recipient needed and nothing more, had never once, in 26 years of marriage to the most financially literate person in his household, asked her what she wrote in her notebook. He had seen it. He had seen it hundreds of times, thousands of times, on the kitchen table in the morning, in her bag at the events they attended together, on the desk in the study, on the bedside table. He knew it was where she kept the household records. He had, on at least a dozen occasions over the years, asked her to check something in it: a staff member's salary, a supplier's contact, a date. She had always found what he was looking for. He had never thought to look further. In 2018, something changed inside the empire that was not visible from the outside. A man named Soo-Yeon Adaeze, the director of the Mauritius holding company that sat at the structural center of the concealment network, a position he had occupied for 11 years, since Kwame had recruited him from a financial services firm in Johannesburg in 2007, made a decision. He had been passed over in a restructuring of the network's upper tier that had taken place in early 2018. A reallocation of beneficial interests that Kwame had executed through the trust structure with the same opaque precision that characterized every significant decision about the network's architecture. Tund had not been consulted. He had not been informed in advance. He had been presented with a new structure as a fait accompli, with a brief communication through an intermediary that framed the change as an administrative rationalization rather than what it actually was, which was a diminishment of his position and, more significantly, a reduction in the financial arrangements that compensated him for the risk his role required him to carry. He was not angry in an obvious way. He did not make calls. He did not confront anyone. He did not issue threats or make demands. He was angry in the specific, cold, patient way that men who have spent 11 years learning from Soo-Yeon Nwosu get angry when they believe they have been treated as expendable. He absorbed the news. He processed it. And then he began, quietly, methodically, to build his own record. He did not know. No one in that entire network. No one in that house on Banana Island. No one in any of the shell companies or holding companies or trust structures across 6 jurisdictions knew that Soo-Yeon Nwosu had been building hers for 14 years. 2 separate operations were now running simultaneously inside the same empire. One conducted by a man who had learned his patience as a student of the person he was now preparing to betray, who knew the network from his specific vantage point in its center and was building outward from that vantage point with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understands that incomplete intelligence is worse than no intelligence. One conducted by a woman whose patience had not been learned from anyone, had not been borrowed or acquired or developed as a professional competence, was constitutional, bone-deep, original, as fundamental to her character as the mathematical precision her mother had drilled into her at a kitchen table in Onitsha before she was old enough to understand why any of it mattered, and who had not been building from a specific vantage point in the center of the network, who had been building from the household, from the accounts, from 14 years of numbers that passed through her hands in their entirety, the full picture, the complete architecture, the view from above that Kwame had specifically designed the rest of the network to prevent. They had never spoken. They did not know about each other. Two people were writing things down in two different places for two different reasons with two very different levels of completeness. By late 2018, the EFCC had received two separate, anonymous disclosures regarding the Nwosu Group's offshore financial structures. The disclosures were sufficiently different in their specificity. One focused on the Mauritius holding structure, one providing broader account-level information across multiple jurisdictions to suggest to the receiving investigators that they had originated from different sources. The investigators noted the discrepancy. They filed both disclosures. They began a preliminary assessment. They could not, at that point, verify enough of the information contained in either disclosure to justify a formal investigation. They waited. At the Banana Island compound, the specific, hermetically sealed rhythm of life at the peak of an empire continued without visible disruption. The children, the eldest son now, 20, beginning a management role in the Nwosu Group's legitimate logistics operation. The daughter, 19, studying international business in London. The youngest son, 14, at a boarding school in Switzerland. Moved through the world with a particular quality of confidence that belongs to people whose entire lived experience has been shaped by the assumption that structural support is available, permanent, and reliable. Kwame traveled. He negotiated. He attended the functions at which his presence was an event in itself. He gave the speeches about legacy and responsibility and the obligation of the successful to the generation following them. And he gave them with the same composed conviction that he had brought to every performance of the public version of himself for 26 years. Soo-Yeon attended every event. She smiled in every photograph. She sat at every table at which a seat had been placed for her. She wore the appropriate dress and said the appropriate things and was, to every person in every room, exactly what she had always appeared to be. The chairman's wife, the gracious, composed, impeccably presented woman who managed the household that housed the empire's principal and raised the children who would eventually inherit it. She was also, every morning in the 2 hours before the household staff arrived and the day began its visible life, sitting at the Macassar ebony desk in the 31st floor office, the desk that was not hers, in the room that was not hers, using the specific intimacy of 2 weeks of solitude, while Kwame traveled to complete the final organization of 14 years of work. 17 folders, 847 pages. The last entry in the current notebook dated to the previous Tuesday. She was nearly ready. The empire was about to discover that it had been living for 14 years inside a case file. I need to stop here for just 5 seconds, because what I just told you, the notebook, the folders, the 2 separate operations running simultaneously, the EFCC waiting with 2 disclosures it couldn't yet verify. That is the halfway point of this story. What comes next is the reason I spent 4 weeks researching before I felt ready to tell it. For weeks reading court documents and financial analyses and contemporaneous accounts, and there were still moments when I had to stop and sit with what I was reading before I could continue. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now, because the next story we are telling makes this one look like a warm-up. Now, back to Soo-Yeon, back to the 31st floor, because the fracture is coming, and it is going to come from the one direction that Adaeze Nwosu, in 26 years of building an empire on the principle of controlling every variable, had never thought to watch. The $1.6 billion peak of the Nwosu empire had a texture, a specific sensory, physical texture, that people who moved through it describe, years later, with the particular vividness that attaches to experiences that have been permanently altered by subsequent events. The headquarters building on Victoria Island occupied 3 full floors of a glass tower whose lobby smelled, at all hours of the day, of fresh flowers and cold leather. The flowers were changed every morning by a florist retained exclusively for this purpose. The leather was the furniture, 12 pieces of it, Italian, all the same shade of cognac brown that Kwame had personally selected from manufacturer catalog in 2009 after spending 40 minutes with samples spread across his desk and rejecting the first 7 options. The air conditioning in the building ran at a temperature that was deliberately and consistently several degrees colder than the standard comfort setting. The effect was subtle but cumulative, a physical signal absorbed by anyone who spent more than 10 minutes in the building, that the environment was controlled, that the control was absolute, and that the person responsible for it had the resources and the will to extend that control to details that most people would not think to control. Kwame's personal office occupied the northwest corner of the 31st floor. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows encompassed the full breadth of Lagos Harbor and, on the clear mornings that the Harmattan made possible between November and February, extended across the Atlantic to a horizon that seemed, from that height and in that light, further away than geography could fully account for. The desk, the Macassar ebony, $47,000, 6 weeks in a Milan crate, sat at an angle to the window that gave him the light without the glare and the view without the distraction. Behind it, in any of 43 hand-tailored suits maintained in rotation by a personal assistant whose sole professional function was their care, Adaeze Nwosu received the people who came to him. People who had meetings in that office spoke about the experience afterward in ways that were remarkably consistent across the years and across the very different types of people who occupied the chair across from his desk. The room felt calibrated, not decorated, not impressive in the conventional, accumulated wealth sense of the word. Calibrated, as if every element of it, from the temperature to the angle of the light to the precise distance between the visitor's chair and the desk, had been considered and positioned with the specific intention of creating a particular internal state in the person sitting opposite him. The internal state it created was the sensation of sitting across from someone whose reality was more complete than yours. Someone who had access to more variables, had processed more information, had considered more contingencies. Someone, in short, who already knew how this conversation was going to end. He was patient in ways that people found, depending on their relationship with him, either reassuring or frightening. He could sit in a negotiation for 4 hours and speak 40 words. He could receive news, difficult news, the kind that requires recalibration, without anything in his face or his body registering the receipt of it. He had processed the worst-case scenario before the meeting began and had moved through it and passed it into a kind of settled certainty about the available responses that read, to the people watching him, as the absence of fear. It was not the absence of fear. It was fear that had been experienced privately, in advance, and completely, and had therefore been consumed before it could be performed. 3 people in his world feared him in the complete, physical, non-negotiable way. 6 worshipped him with the specific dependent intensity of people whose professional identity had become inseparable from proximity to his success. The rest, the lawyers and bankers and officials and executives and diplomats who populated the landscape of his daily operations, operated with the careful, calibrated awareness of people who know they are less intelligent than the person they are dealing with and who conduct themselves accordingly. One person understood him, not feared, not worshipped, understood with the specific, unsentimental clarity that only comes from years of close, daily, unperformed observation, from knowing the sound of his breathing in the night, from seeing 1,000 times the precise order in which he processed information and arrived at decisions, from being the person in his household who managed the accounts through which everything eventually flowed. She understood that the empire had a flaw, not in its legal architecture, not in its financial structure. The legal architecture was by the assessment of the attorneys who would eventually be hired to defend it, genuinely sophisticated, constructed with a level of technical precision that suggested the involvement of multiple specialized advisors over multiple years. The flaw was simpler than that. The flaw was that its architect had decided, at some point early in the construction, that the person managing his household was not a relevant variable, that the woman with the first-class finance degree and the red leather notebook was, in the categorization that mattered, the household manager, the domestic administrator, the organizer of staff rosters and dinner menus and the children's school calendars, not someone who needed to be managed in the way that the directors of the Mauritius holding company needed to be managed, not someone who needed to be given only their piece of the picture, only their portion of the information, the minimum required for their function, and nothing more. She was the household. The household was not the empire. The household was just where he slept. This was the mistake. The single, foundational, irretrievable mistake in 26 years of otherwise extraordinary operational discipline. And in 2019, on a Tuesday morning in a 31st floor office, the consequences of that mistake were organized into 17 folders and placed in a document bag. The call lasted 41 seconds. 3 sentences. The first confirmed that the 17 folders were ready and in her possession. The second confirmed that she had reviewed and understood the sequence of the filings and the order in which the consequences would follow. The third was not about the filings. The third sentence was about the children. What she asked for in that third sentence in 41 seconds on a Tuesday morning was a specific legal protection for the charitable trust through which the Nwosu Foundation operated, the entity responsible for the 40,000 children fed annually across 3 states, the hospital wing, the university building, the scholarship program. She had thought about the children, all the children, her own 3 and the 40,000 others. She had conditions. The filings were submitted simultaneously at 9:47 a.m. The EFCC filing, the central bank notification, and the federal court submission, 3 separate legal actions, each with its own documentation, each referencing the others, each constructed so that no single response to any one of them could be effective without also addressing the other 2. 847 pages in total. 14 years of account numbers, transaction dates and amounts, shell company registration documents from 4 jurisdictions cross-referenced with payment record from 6 financial institutions, correspondence, emails, letters, internal memoranda. That placed Soo-Yeon Nwosu personally and explicitly in knowledge of specific transactions that were not compatible with legitimate business operations. Beneficial ownership documentation for the trust structures that the corporate layers have been specifically designed to obscure, and running through all of it, the connective tissue, the single element that transformed a collection of financial documents into a complete, coherent, prosecutable narrative, the handwritten records from a red leather notebook, organized chronologically across 14 years, cross-referenced internally, annotated in a handwriting so precise, so consistent, so meticulously maintained across 14 years of daily recording, that the forensic accountant hired by the EFCC to assess it would write in her report that the documentation represented a standard of personal financial record-keeping that she had not previously encountered in 20 years of professional practice. The accounts froze at 11:58 a.m. Not flagged, frozen, at 12:30 in the afternoon. For the Nwosu Group's most senior executives received calls from the compliance departments of their personal banks. By 1:15 p.m., the Nwosu Group's Lagos legal team was in emergency session in the conference room on the 28th floor of the Victoria Island headquarters, with additional attorneys being reached by phone in London and Mauritius. By 2 p.m., Tun Seo-Jun Bello received the news in his office in Port Louis, Mauritius, sat with it for a long moment, and then began to understand, with the sickening precision of a person who has spent months building toward a specific destination and has just been told that someone arrived there before them, that everything he had prepared was no longer necessary. Someone had moved first. Someone had moved with more, with better, with a completeness that his own documentation, focused on his corner of the network, could not approach. He closed his laptop. He had nothing left to file. Kwame received the first call at 12:44 p.m. Lagos time. He was at the window table he had specifically requested at the Kempinski Gold Coast Hotel in Accra. He was in the middle of a sentence about a contract he had spent 4 months developing, a contract that represented, in the legitimate structure of the Nwosu Group, the kind of clean, above-board, properly documented business transaction that had always been the public face of everything he built. He did not finish the sentence. He excused himself, walked to the corridor. The corridor of the Kempinski Gold Coast Hotel in Accra on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sounds of the hotel operating normally around him, the housekeeping cart somewhere nearby, the distant sound of the restaurant, the ambient hum of a building full of people whose ordinary afternoon was continuing without interruption. He listened, then his lawyer, then the lawyer again, then a number in his contacts list that he recognized as belonging to a person in government whose name he would not speak aloud in a hotel corridor in a country that was not Nigeria, whose involvement in the matters now unfolding was sufficiently sensitive that the call, at this moment, in this location, represented a risk he would normally never accept. He took anyway. He stood in that corridor for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. He did not speak for the entirety of those 4 minutes and 22 seconds. The person on the other end of the phone, who had worked with Kwame Nwosu for 19 years, who had been in rooms with him during moments that would have caused most people to visibly, physically react, who had considered himself something of an expert in the range of Kwame's responses to adverse information, said afterward that the silence was the most frightening thing he had experienced in 20 years of working at the level he worked at. Not frightening because of what it threatened. Frightening because it was the first time in 19 years that he had heard Kwame Nwosu not know what to say. When Kwame spoke, he asked one question, not about the accounts, not about the legal exposure, not about which of the political relationships could still be leveraged, or how quickly the international attorneys could be mobilized, or whether there was a jurisdiction in which the filings could be challenged before they became effective. He asked, how long has she had this? The answer, 14 years, crossed the distance between Lagos and Accra and arrived in the hotel corridor and settled there like a physical object, like something with weight and dimension that the space around it had to accommodate. For minutes and 22 seconds of silence. One question, one answer, then nothing. What happened in Kwame Nwosu's mind in that corridor? The specific, comprehensive recalibration of 26 years of marriage through the lens of 14 years of deliberate, systematic, secret documentation was described in the weeks and months that followed by several people who spoke to him during that period. What they described was not what they expected, not the cold fury, not the calculating, forward-looking damage assessment of a man who has always processed crisis as a resource management problem. What they described was something that looked like recognition. Specifically, the recognition of something that had always been present and that he had, for reasons he was now reconstructing with the comprehensive, devastating clarity of retrospect, never thought to look at directly. One person who spoke to him in those first 48 hours said afterward, he kept saying she was the only one who actually understood all of it, the whole picture, better than anyone. He kept saying he knew that. He had always known that. And he had just never. The sentence was not finished. He flew back to Lagos that evening. He did not call Soo-Yeon. He did not send a message. He sat in the back of the armored Mercedes that met him at the airport. The familiar smell of cedar and cold leather. The privacy glass between him and the driver. The city moving past the windows with its usual indifferent vitality. And he looked at Lagos through the glass. The city he had spent 26 years shaping. The city where his name was on buildings and his face was in newspapers and his voice was the voice that people in certain rooms stopped other conversations to hear. The city where, at this precise moment, investigators were working through 847 pages of documentation organized by his wife. For the first time in 26 years, Soo-Yeon Nwosu could not calculate what came next. Before I tell you exactly how this ends, I want to know what you think happened. Drop a comment right now. One of three options. Option A. Soo-Yeon walked away completely free. The documentation was so complete and her cooperation so total that she was granted full protection as a cooperating witness and never faced a single charge in any jurisdiction. Option B. Kwame found a way to negotiate. An agreement was reached. The empire did not fall completely. Some of the money was never recovered, and some of the consequences were never fully applied. Option C. The real ending involved something that was never officially confirmed, something that the court proceedings documented only partially, that the official record captures only in outline, and that the full truth of has never been publicly told. Drop your answer below. Then do not move, because the actual ending of this story is going to make you go back and rewatch everything you just saw with completely different eyes. The EFCC proceedings against Soo-Yeon Nwosu lasted 3 years. In that time, 11 subsidiary executives and directors across the network's various entities were charged with financial crimes in Nigerian and foreign jurisdictions. 4 of them entered plea arrangements, cooperation agreements that provided reduced charges in exchange for testimony and documentary evidence. 7 of them contested the charges through a legal process that, across its full duration in 3 jurisdictions, cost the Nwosu Group's remaining legal fund an estimated $40 million. $40 million in legal fees. The empire that had once generated $300 million annually in concealed revenue was spending its remaining accessible capital defending itself against the documentation of a woman with a red leather notebook. Of the estimated $1.2 billion identified in Soo-Yeon's filings, $847 million was recovered across accounts in Nigeria, Mauritius, Singapore, and the United Kingdom. The recovery was executed through asset freezing orders, international mutual legal assistance requests, and, in the case of the Singapore accounts, a process of negotiation between Nigerian authorities and Singaporean regulators that took 14 months and produced an outcome that both governments described, in their respective public statements, as a significant milestone in international financial crime cooperation. The remaining amount, The gap between 1.2 billion and 847 million, somewhere between $300 and $400 million, depending on which jurisdiction's accounting you use as the basis, was never located. Whether it was successfully moved in the 47 minutes between Soo-Yeon's call and the first account freeze. Whether it existed within structures that the documentation, comprehensive as it was, had not reached. Whether some portion of it had been moved years earlier into arrangements that the 14 years of records could not trace. No official account has ever explained this gap completely. 47 minutes. Kwame's legal team argued, at multiple stages of the proceedings, that the documentation had been obtained through a breach of marital confidentiality, that the shell company structures were compliant with the laws of their jurisdictions of registration, and that the scale and speed of the EFCC's action reflected political motivations unconnected to genuine regulatory concern. These arguments were pursued with the full resources of the most expensive criminal defense team assembled in Nigerian legal history to that point. They delayed the proceedings. They did not stop them. In 2022, following 3 years of proceedings across Nigerian and international jurisdictions, Soo-Yeon Adaeze was convicted on 12 counts of financial crime, money laundering, and related offenses. He was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. The sentence was reduced to 11 years on appeal through a process that 3 separate civil society organizations characterized in terms their own legal counsel subsequently advised them to soften before publication as reflecting considerations beyond the strictly legal. He is currently serving that sentence. The hospital wing that bears his name in Lagos still stands. The construction was funded through the Nwosu Foundation's legitimate charitable endowment, which was established and maintained separately from the concealment network, and which Soo-Yeon had negotiated, specifically, as a named condition of her cooperation with the EFCC, inserted into the cooperation agreement before she signed it, be protected through the asset recovery process. The foundation still operates. The 40,000 children are still fed. Soo-Yeon Nwosu was granted full immunity from prosecution in recognition of the nature and completeness of her cooperation with the EFCC. The presiding judge, in his written ruling on the question of her status, described the 14 years of documentation she had produced as a singular act of civic courage executed at extraordinary personal risk over an extraordinary period of time, and noted that the quality and completeness of the evidence she had provided had made the proceedings possible in a way that no other investigative route available to the authorities could have achieved. She was 51 years old when the proceedings concluded. She has not spoken publicly about any aspect of the case. She has not given a single interview. Her 3 children, the eldest son, the daughter, the youngest, have each, in the particular and private ways that children navigate the aftermath of events that restructure everything they believed about their family, continued. The eldest son restructured the legitimate logistics operations of what remained of the Nwosu Group under a new corporate name, and those operations continue profitably under his management. The daughter relocated to Seoul, where her grandmother's family had maintained connections across the decades of hygiene's life in Nigeria. The youngest son, by the accounts of people who know the family, does not speak regularly to either of his parents. What happened inside that family, the specific human, unreported consequence of 41 seconds and 14 years, is a story that has not been told and may never be. Tun Seojun Bello cooperated with the EFCC as a secondary witness. His testimony was, by the account of the lead prosecutor in the case, useful in corroborating specific elements of the financial record. It was not, by that point, necessary. Everything the prosecution required was already in the 847 pages. His name appears twice in the publicly available court documents. Soo-Yeon Nwosu's name appears 1,247 times. And here is the thing that I keep returning to. The thing that has stayed with me through 4 weeks of research and will, I suspect, stay with me considerably longer. Soo-Yeon Nwosu built something that took 26 years. $1.6 billion. 43 household staff. 12 security personnel. Political relationships maintained across 3 presidential administrations in 2 countries. A network of shell companies, holding companies, and trust structures spanning 6 jurisdictions and requiring the ongoing services of attorneys in 4 countries. A public reputation so carefully constructed over so many years with so many institutional investments that 300 people attended his 50th birthday celebration and applauded when he spoke about legacy. Soo-Yeon Adaeze dismantled it with a notebook, a phone call, and 41 seconds. Not because she was more powerful, not because she had more resources or more institutional support or more of anything that the conventional accounting of power would recognize as decisive. Because she had been paying attention for 14 years while he was looking everywhere else. Because her mother had sat at a kitchen table in Onitsha and taught her, before she was old enough to understand all the reasons why, that the world does not give itself to you. You document it. You record what happens. You note what is spent and what is earned, what is agreed and what is delivered, what is said and, in a separate column maintained with particular diligence, what is promised. And you keep the notebook, because a woman who keeps records keeps power. Remember what I told you at the very beginning of this story, about the small red leather notebook that Soo-Yeon's mother placed in her hands on the morning of her wedding in 1996. About the 7 words her mother spoke when she gave it to her. Write everything down. A woman who keeps records keeps power. I told you that at the very start. I told you it is atmosphere. As a detail about a mother and a daughter on a wedding morning, intimate and private and unremarkable in the context of everything that surrounded it. Now you know why I started there. Because the most powerful object in a $1.6 billion empire, more powerful than the Macassar ebony desk, more powerful than the armored Mercedes, more powerful than the G650 and the political relationships and the 43 suits and the shell companies across 6 jurisdictions, was a small red leather notebook that a Korean-Nigerian woman from Onitsha gave her daughter on a morning in Lagos, and that a man who understood money and power and danger and information at an extraordinary level of sophistication never once in 26 years thought to look inside. That notebook is currently in the possession of the EFCC. It has been entered into evidence. It has been cataloged, preserved, and stored in accordance with the requirements of a court order that specifies its retention for a minimum of 20 years. And somewhere, in a facility outside Abuja, Soo-Yeon Nwosu has approximately 11 years to think about what his wife wrote in it. The most dangerous person in any empire is never the one with the most power. It is the one with the most patience. Subscribe if you have not already. Turn on notifications. Because the next story on this channel is about a woman in Nairobi who spent 9 years being called her husband's personal secretary, while in her possession the entire time was the single document that gave her legal ownership of everything he had built. I have already finished the research. I'm still not entirely certain I was ready for what I found. I will see you there.